of interest and what I call postdoctoral implementation is the financing of low-cost non-state schools in Africa. So my whole PhD also is on the financing of low-cost non-state schools, and we'll look at some of the findings from that, but how that informs this area of what I call thriving by 5. So the key area of input into children, into their cognitive development, their social development, etc. People are recognising it as being key now, but very little money has gone into that, certainly from governments in Africa. And I think low-cost schools can provide a suitable vehicle to meeting that opportunity, so that need, which would have benefits for the economies in Africa, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. That's what I'm planning to hopefully explore with you. As we go through this, if you have any questions or you disagree with me on anything, you're welcome to put up your hand and say what you have to say. We can discuss it. So don't feel that you have to wait till the end if I say something that isn't clear. Is that all right? Just by way of background, I trained as a chartered accountant in the city that specialised in small businesses. So I applied to the big firms in the provinces, medium-sized firms in London. I wanted to do small and medium-sized enterprises. That's where I felt was the relevant kind of part of the economy, which was underfinanced, underappreciated, yet created most jobs. And so I did that, and then I worked in strategy and planning for a large British retailer called BHS, competing with Marks and Spencer. Unfortunately, Philip Green came along and got his hands on the pension fund and destroyed a whole successful listed company. But that was after my time. And then I went to work in South Africa for 4 years, pre-election, election transition, running a fair trade organisation, and trying to turn that around. Then I came back to the UK and joined CDC, now called BII, so Commonwealth Development Corporation, so investing in emerging markets. And I was investing in banks and financial institutions in Africa, trying to add value to those investments, and particularly trying to focus on small and medium-sized businesses. We'll see the importance of financial institutions for this sector in due course. Then I went from there to Botswana, where I worked for a banking group there to help them expand, and then set up my own thing, which invested in banks in Kenya and Rwanda, and brought that SME focus. And then came back to the UK, set up a new fund to do that all over Africa, and that's when I got involved in Oxford, and they asked me to come and teach on this impact investing side of things. So I kind of teach for about 8 weeks of the year, and then work in Africa with impact investors to try and get finance into the low-cost education space. That's what I get up to when not playing the piano and other nice things. Okay, so I just want to give a little bit of the historical context to this early childhood development, childcare space and low-cost schools, and give you some information that I derived from the involvement in a program of 5 years in Lagos called Deepen. What we found in both that situation and also what we found in my PhD research. And then I want to take you through some examples of some initiatives to get finance, government involvement, so support, greater access and quality to childcare in ECD, in Rwanda and Uganda, and also South Africa and Kenya in particular. We'll touch on a few other countries. I think it's quite nice, hopefully, to give you some examples of what people are trying to do. Because the challenge is huge, the opportunity is huge. And if we can do something in this area, it will have a significant impact on these economies going forward. And then we'll look at the economic impact of this, if we get this right, and the financing implications, and we'll conclude. Okay. So can I just ask a question in terms of who's in the room? How many of you doing anything to do with education? How many of you are doing anything to do with, a few of you, economics? Okay. How many of you with developing economies? Africa, Asia, India. So is your economics mainly Europe and America, first world? People doing economics? So you're forgiven for that. It's not as interesting as the developing world, I would suggest. But so we'll see what we come up with here, and you can say, does this relate to the countries that you're normally looking at? Okay, when we talk about private schools, often in the West, we think of places like Eton and Harrow and Rugby and Stowe, because these are the kind of private schools that we're familiar with. And they tend to be quite expensive and not accessible to most people. Okay, so private schools in Africa are a different kettle of fish. Okay, they tend to be charging $10 a month for people to go attend that school. This is Vinson Centre, who set up Lekki Peninsula College in Lagos. That's a typical kind of playground. It's not bad. You've got proper roofs and walls, but nothing like the resources here. Okay, so these are the low-cost schools that we're talking about. Often the early years and the childcare ones are even more basic, because they're often in people's gardens or in their houses, in a shack at the back, and so very rudimentary. Okay, so we have to take off our Western lenses when we look at education in Africa. So in terms of history, during the colonial period, there was a demand for education was quite small, because the colonial powers only really wanted to have educated the people who were going to work in the administration, in the railways, and to actually keep the colony going from an administrative point of view. And so they provided government schools or mission schools often to educate the kind of small number of people that they wanted. Okay, so that was how it was arranged. So the majority of the population didn't have any education. Then what happened was demand increased, and you ended up with state schools being complemented by private schools. And again, these were tend to be the more expensive schools. So doing often Cambridge exams, O-levels and A-levels, so that people could have the opportunity of studying abroad. But you can see the demand is increasing, and this is post-independence. The governments typically said, okay, we want to focus on universal primary education. Not secondary, not early years, primary. So that was where all the resources went in terms of teachers, schools, and so forth. And the demand was greater than the supply, because the population was growing, there was urbanisation, and there was migration. So that's post-independence. You've got the situation where most state schools were primary and the demand was greater than the supply. And then what happened was, with the population growth, migration, and urbanisation, demand continued to grow, and state schools were actually pretty static, because during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you had structural adjustment programs where these countries got themselves into debt. The IMF and World Bank said, we'll forgive you your debt, but the condition is that you live within your fiscal bounds, i.e. you don't spend more than you've got. And therefore, that typically meant they had to freeze civil servant posts, and teachers are government employees, so they fall under that restriction. So the government wasn't allowed to build new schools, wasn't able to employ more teachers, and yet the demand was increasing. So unemployed teachers, because often make teachers unemployed, saw that there was an opportunity here. And so these low-cost private schools started to appear, because people saw the need on their doorstep in their communities. The children weren't in school because there wasn't enough space in the state school, they were too far away, and they started to set up their own enterprises. So that's how this kind of sector started to grow. And does that make sense to people? So it's different to the I've just been showing you your library upstairs, and West, who wrote about this whole area. He talks about the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and the fact that pre-1870, most education in Britain was in this low-cost space, Dane schools, etc. And then when the 1870 Education Act was passed, and over the next 10 to 20 years, it became increasingly difficult for these local schools to operate independently unless they were absorbed into the government system, including a lot of the church schools. That didn't happen in Africa. It was the other way around. The state schools were there at the beginning, and then these low-cost schools started to appear because the government schools were not able to absorb the demand. So it was the reverse of what we see in the West. So we have to say, okay, whether I'm not saying it's right or wrong, it's different. And I think we have to respect the fact that it's different. So I was, when I mentioned I lived in Botswana, my neighbour was the kind of European Union, British advisor on education to the whole SADC region. And he was involved in setting up a census in Lagos, in Nigeria. And officially, in Lagos at the time, the government was educating 70% of children. So the population around 15 to 20 million in Lagos. Government educating 70%, non-government sector, low-cost schools and expensive schools, 30%. Okay, and the British government, for years and years and years, had actually been pumping money into state education for teacher training, etc., and ignored the non-state sector. Okay. They did a census in Lagos and actually went round all the streets and counted how many schools there were and how many children were enrolled in those schools. And what they found was the official numbers were the wrong way around. Well, they were wrong because the reality was 70% of children were enrolled in non-state low-cost schools and 30% in government schools.
When was that? Sorry, I missed.
Lagos.
Yes, where? But when was that done?
This was 2010.
2010.
So they did that census. And the reason why, why do you think, you economists, why do you think the official numbers by government, World Bank, UNICEF, etc., why do you think they were so far out?
We have some evidence that schools will kind of cook the books because, of course, if you have more students, you get more funding, would be one cynical explanation.
Where's the funding coming from?
The government. But if you have a per pupil funding and
perhaps possibly. In this instance, there was no funding for these schools.
I went for the state schools why the numbers would appear higher in the
Oh, you think the state schools may have overstated how many children were going there? That's possible. That's possible. And when they actually counted, they found that it wasn't. That wasn't the reality. Any other ideas?
Were they actually aware of the private sector? I mean, there must have been to do the survey eventually, but the statistics presumably were calculated never many years before, and so on. They did surveys before, and they just weren't aware really of that somehow there was a market out there which was developing through pure requirements of the population. The government just wasn't satisfying.
I think that's definitely the case because what the government did was they only counted licensed schools.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Now, state schools, by definition, are licensed. Yeah. 75% of the low-cost schools in Lagos weren't licensed, so they were missing from the data. And also, it's probably true to say that most of the officials working in the Ministry of Education, their children weren't going to these low-cost schools.
Right.
Yeah. It was their drivers' children, or their housekeepers' children, or their gardeners' children who were going to these low-cost schools, not the kind of well-paid civil servants or the bankers or people in industry. So I think there was a general level of ignorance as to the significance of this sector. So when they actually counted how many schools there were, they actually captured that data, and the British government said, well, we've ignored this for... that's fine. We've ignored this sector, we need to do something about it. So they created a scheme called Deepen, a program called Deepen, 5 years, to say, how do we improve the regulatory environment of these non-state sector to make it a bit more realistic and easier to get licenses? Because in Nigeria, you had to have 5 hectares of land to get a school license. You had to employ qualified teachers to get a school license. These are things that are almost impossible to do in a high density high population density area. And even if you could find land, could you afford it? And what has that got to do with the quality of education? I'm not saying it's not an important thing to have space for your children, but 5 hectares of land is a lot of land. And most of the teachers, half the teachers, 75% of the teachers in these schools are not licensed, not qualified. They're typically young women who learn on the job and they do the best they can. And they're not qualified certified teachers. So again, a certified teacher in the States will typically is paid 3 times what these local school teachers are paid. So the economics of local education unfortunately requires lower pay of teachers because you're trying to charge affordable fees to your parents. Okay, so that's part of the economics of the situation. The neighbour in Botswana said to me, we're doing a 5-year programme, would I come and be the advisor on the finance stream? Because when you ask these schools what their biggest challenge was, they said our biggest challenge isn't the regulations, it's actually access to credit to grow and expand. They wanted to borrow money to build new classrooms, improve the equipment, etc., to try and potentially get a license if they could. But they couldn't get the money from the banks because the banks didn't have the money. They saw it as too risky, or if you're not licensed, there's a danger you'll be closed down. So the schools were in a vicious circle. So could we actually try and, as you were saying, make the financial sector aware of this situation and the opportunity there? And this is what we ended up trying to address. So first of all, that certification, which I told you about, 20% of the schools had access to credit, so could we increase that? And 30% of them were not even banked, they had no banking relationship. So what could we do to change that? So they had low trust with regulators and they had low trust with banks. But these schools had high trust with parents and community. 50% of those schools have been going for more than 10 years. 75% for more than 5 years. So for small and medium-sized enterprises, they were remarkably robust and successful in terms of charging low fees, educating on average 160 children, and employing teachers, most of whom were unqualified, but providing a safe environment. And importantly, the education outcomes tended to be better than in the state schools. Now, how's that measured? Everybody in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa has to take an end of primary school exam to move on to secondary school. And you have to get over a certain mark to get onto secondary school. Because at secondary school level, there are fewer schools available for children from the primary school sector. So there's much more competition to get into the better secondary school. And so parents are prepared to sacrifice up to 40% of their income for their children to go to these local schools to actually come out with a better end of primary school exam and go on to a decent secondary school, and potentially get scholarships. If you get over a certain mark in those national exams and do well, you can get a scholarship to go to secondary school. So there's an incentive to do well. And we calculated that the demand for finance in these local schools was about $2.8 million in Lagos.
You might want to park this question for later, you may be covering it later, but can I ask about how these schools are set up? Are they basically profit-making schools, set up with one person or something? Or, or are there some, how can I put it, mutual kind of schools run by local people as a club, so to speak, or through churches or religious associations? I just,
it's a mixture.
That might be relevant in terms of trust. I just wondered about. Anyway, sorry, that's something you might want to park.
Well, no, it's relevant because when you look at this, about 8% of the schools, these local schools, have some church affiliation, right? Some faith affiliation. So they may actually attract people from the local church because of that. But it's still a small percentage. In rural areas, you tend to get more of those what are called community schools, where the community get together and will fund the school, in which case the trust is automatically is more likely to be there because the community are involved in the establishment and the management of the schools. But the vast majority of all these schools are individual enterprises run by women, right? Responding to the need on their doorstep, and they see themselves as social enterprises. Yeah. And they are profitable. So we calculated what the profitability was to share with the financial sector, saying on average, these schools are making between 10 and 30% net profit. and they're only collecting 70% of the fees. So for every 10 places, effectively 3 places are being provided free of charge. Now that's not because they're being particularly kind to people, but because they see themselves as a social enterprise. If a parent has a problem paying fees, they say, well, try and keep your child in the school and pay what you can, rather than we're just going to keep the child out because you're not paying. So they try and be accommodating, which I don't think is appreciated by the authorities.
So you're talking predominantly about primary schools in this low-cost sector. So there's a movement for them to go out and offer their own secondary versions?
Very few of the primary schools tend to bolt on a secondary school, because the secondary schools tend to have greater requirements for finance in terms of CapEx and laboratories and so forth. The cost of secondary education is much higher because you have to have subject matter teachers who've got a degree in maths or history or English and so forth. In these local schools, you don't tend to have degrees, if anything, you have teaching certificates. So the cost of teaching is much more. So those are the reasons. But what's interesting about these local schools is 65% of them, the 7 cities I looked at in my research, are combined early years and primary. So they're not just standalone primary. If you remember this, the primary education provided by the government was only primary. These local schools typically are early years combined with primary, and that's largely because the way they evolve is a woman will start a school with childcare. And the parents say, you've done a good job this year, will you come back next year? Sorry, will you actually take on our child next year? So they have another year. And then they add on primary 1, primary 2. And before we know it, in 8 years, they've got a whole combined early years and primary. And going to this point of educational outcomes, one of the things that I think was interesting was, and we look at this now in terms of childcare and early childhood development, the importance of that, in terms of cognitive development, social development, maths, numeracy, and so forth. Most of the children from these schools have had the benefit of early years and primary, whereas in the state schools it's only primary. So it shouldn't surprise us that these children are doing better than in the state schools, because they've had the benefit of early years stimulation. But the other important factor was teacher absenteeism. In the government schools, if teachers turn up for 2 days in 5, it's a lot. And nobody does anything about it, because the teachers get paid whether they turn up for work or not. And even if they're in school for those 2 days, it doesn't mean that they're teaching. So, whereas in these local schools, because the teachers typically are from the community and are accountable, they tend to turn up for work every day and they're motivated and do the best they can. They may not be as qualified as the teachers in the state school, but they are in the classroom. And therefore, that also feeds into the fact that the teachers are doing a better job. Plus also the class size is on average 20 versus officially 40, but in reality probably 60 to 80 in the government schools. So if you're a parent, you've got a choice of sending your child to a school which may be several kilometres away, or the cost of transport and the dangers involved, or a local school on your doorstep, where do you choose to send it? And if you're sending it to the state school, it doesn't cost as much, but your child is in a class of 80 and the teacher's not there for 3 days in 5, what's your child going to learn? So I think parents have been quite, informed and sensible in terms of making these decisions, an economic decision to sacrifice to invest in their child's education. So I did that work in 7 other cities, because what I was interested in was Lagos a one-off with 70% of children go to these local schools, or did it exist elsewhere in Africa? So I looked at Kampala, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam in East Africa, Lusaka in Southern Africa, and then Accra, Abidjan, and Abuja in West Africa. And what we found was that on average, 52% of children are going to these low-cost schools in those 7 cities. And in some places like Kampala, it's actually higher than Lagos, 86%. In places like Dar es Salaam, it's much lower at 14%. we can look at the reasons for that. But the history of the country and its policy towards education and its enforcement of regulations is a critical factor. So in Lagos, for example, 75% of those schools are not licensed, but the government doesn't really close them down because it realises it can't accommodate them in the state schools, so it kind of puts up with this. Plus also, if you're an official and you visit a school and say you don't seem to have a licence, I'm going to close you down unless you pay me. It provides a rent-seeking opportunity. So the civil servants themselves benefit from this system. Whereas in Dar es Salaam, they're much more rigorous in terms of if you haven't got a licence, they'll close you down. So you end up with a much stricter approach to unlicensed schools in Tanzania compared to Nigeria. So, but that was just that. So Lagos wasn't a one-off, is what we found. It was actually something happening in other cities, and it was growing at roughly 8% per annum. So in all those cities, it was either a majority or in the next few years it would become the majority provider of education. Going back to your point earlier, none of these schools receive any money from the government, the low-cost non-state schools.
You don't have Gaborone there.
No, I don't have Gaborone there because Gaborone's only got a population of 2 million people.
Okay.
And what's interesting about Gaborone is most of the education in Gaborone is state provided, because when Suetsi Kama and Botswana got independence, they discovered diamonds, the government was quite enlightened in saying we're going to put money into education. So they didn't have the problems with structural investment programs that the other countries had because they were quite wealthy. And so the government provided education. There's still some private schools, but not very many, and there's certainly not very many low-cost schools because the government was quite generous in providing. It's more of a Western model of state provision. It's a fair point. I could have done Botswana, but I thought it was more interesting to do the other countries. Let's just give you a comparison of local schools versus state-run schools. We talked about licensing. School size is much bigger, 1,000 versus 160. Talk about class sizes. Even in the state schools, there's a cost to the parent because they have to pay for uniforms, parent-teachers association. So even a government school, which is officially free, parents have to pay roughly $40 per annum. Whereas that's versus $120 per annum in the local schools. So that's why you get after-school children. So UNICEF estimate that around 20% of children in Africa are still out of school. Often rural areas, but also urban areas where they can't afford that $40. And we talk about education quality. So this was from my PhD research, this is what I found, that education quality is good and better than the state, but access to finance is still a problem. It's actually worse than Lagos. Only 15% of these schools have been able to access credit. And I estimated the unmet demand for finance was about 1.8 billion. So add that to the Lagos number, and you're at $4.6 billion just in those 8 cities. And they want to borrow money, as I mentioned, classrooms, but also working capital. And so there seemed to be an opportunity there for the financial sector to do something. Remember how long those schools have been going? That they're profitable, but they're not licensing. There's a problem here. Can we actually do something about the licensing and regulation? Can we do something about access to credit? And can we link that to measurement of education quality?
Can I ask about the difference between licensed and unlicensed schools? Private schools, some are unlicensed, some are licensed. Is there any difference in the quality?
Between a licensed school and an unlicensed school?
Just in that, ignoring the state licensing, just in the private low-cost sector, is there any difference as a matter of interest between the quality outcomes in the licensed and unlicensed sector?
So there's definitely a difference in the quality between the expensive license, but in terms of the low-cost license versus the unlicensed low-cost, I didn't investigate the discrepancy between that.
It doesn't matter.
It'd be interesting to know what the thing is. What was interesting is in Lagos, when we actually worked with the government to change rules and regulations to make it more accessible, and achievable, they brought in a kind of 1-star to 5-star grading system. And as long as you registered as a school and became 1-star, then they promised they wouldn't close you down for 3 years, which is what we thought might unlock some of the finance. And the way they got the 1-star was they had to answer questions in terms of, do you do this, do you do that, do you have these toilets, do you have that, and so forth. And what we found was just by answering those questions actually led to an improvement in the quality of education, because they started doing things that they hadn't necessarily been aware of. And then those results will be validated, and then the idea was you hopefully move from 1-star to 2-star to 3-star and 4-star. So there's a much more pragmatic approach rather than the government rules and regulations, which are all on inputs and nothing to do with education outcomes. So that's one of the challenges about education: what are you measuring? How do you determine what is important? Okay. And as you can see, if you're requiring all teachers to be certified, then you've got a problem, because only 52% of the teachers in the school are certified. Now, what they did in Kenya, when they called it affordable private education schools, they said, okay, we expect a third to be qualified. So the government became much more pragmatic, saying, okay, try and get a third to be qualified, and we'll give you a license. So again, you can't. It's impossible to ignore the government when it comes to education, because the governments all realise they have a responsibility for education. Doesn't mean they have to be responsible for providing it, but they have a responsibility for their children suitably educated. So can we change their mentality to actually work with the low-cost school sector, which is employing so many people, educating so many children, but gets no government recognition, and actually governments make it difficult for them. I mentioned earlier about early childhood development being that 65% of these schools are combined early years and primary, and we'll look at Rwanda in a moment. And we talk about vested interests. That there are organised unions out there, civil servants out there, procurement, and I mentioned Dirk on here, who wrote this very interesting book on gambling on development. So he was saying, I've been the chief economist for the British government in its development work for 30 years. What have I learned? What works, what doesn't work? And he looked at China, it's a comparative study with Nigeria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. And he basically says, unless you come to a deal, unless you come to a bargain with your ruling elite, commercial, political, social elite in a country, you're really not going to get broad-based economic development. So if any of you are interested in economic growth and development, I would recommend that you look at Dirk on, because it's probably one of the best books I've read in terms of an up-to-date comparison of why countries do well versus countries that stay behind. Obviously, he looks at Singapore and some of the Asian countries as well. But there are vested interests that don't want to change the status quo. The unions are quite happy with their teachers not being held to account for turning up for work and doing their job properly. Civil servants are quite happy with the rent-seeking opportunity that this provides. And aid goes historically into government ministries for procurement, and a lot of it disappears. So it's a nice way of benefiting from corruption. With state education, money coming into the ministry but not going into the schools or into the teachers. And the nice thing I think about low-cost schools is it tends to, apart from the corruption that they face with civil servants, the parents are paying their fees. There's very little room for corruption because you've got to pay your teachers. And they're doing the best they can in the private sector to try and make the situation work and deliver a good quality education. But the problem with education quality measurement is, I mentioned that everybody does the end of primary school exam, but if you're not a licensed school, you can't enter your children for the end of primary school exam. Okay, so if you're not a licensed school, you have to find another school who will take your children under their umbrella to sit that end of primary school exam. So the school knows how its children have done because they get the results through the other school. But they don't actually, nobody reports the actual results per school. because those non-licensed schools can't enter. And you can fix that quite easily if each school is allowed to enter its children, licensed or non-licensed, which I think would be an equitable and fair thing to do.
Do the licensed school get the benefit of any good performance on the part of an unlicensed school entrance?
Yeah, they do.
They do, right.
So,
yeah.
A colleague of mine was involved in Pakistan in the establishment of 80 low-cost schools in rural Sindh, with communities where there was no school. And so she said to the communities, do you want a school? I got some philanthropic money to build a simple structure, but after that you have to pay the cost of the teacher. And the community said, yes, we would like one. This is how much we can afford for a teacher. So they would recruit a teacher to teach the whole of the primary school, and they would pay their little amounts of money. But she also asked them, what do you mean by education? What does education look like? Good education look like to you? And the parents said, we want our children to be articulate, and we want them to be confident. And so when they saw their children coming back from school articulate and confident, they said, we're getting what we're paying for. So that built up trust. And so the next year they said, okay, we'd like another teacher. And gradually grew in terms of the amounts that they paid, but also the school grew and they were able to employ more teachers. But because these schools were dealing with marginalised communities, they were unable to enter their children in the Pakistan end of primary school exam. So what did they do? The headmistress or headmaster would go to the nearest government school and say, can we sit our children for the exam under you? And because that headmaster knew that they were getting decent education here, he said, that's going to boost my results. He said, be my guest. And so that's how it worked. Now, I think it would be much better for all schools to enter their children directly and everybody to be, for that information to be publicly available. They were doing this in Kenya for licensed schools up until 2015. But there, it was too embarrassing for the government because their schools were doing so badly versus the non-states licensed schools that they said, we're going to stop. This is not good for the society to have this information in the public domain. So they stopped publishing it. So again, it comes down to these vested interests of, where do we have it before? Okay. Okay, wherever it's gone. The vested interest. Yeah, you have to take that on if you want to bring about change. So the question is, how do you make government look good, but at the same time potentially embarrassing poor performance? And the vested interest, they don't want you to deal with that. It's not easy to get this right. Which is where I think when we come on to early years and childcare, it's less contentious because governments have never really put money into that space. And most of the early years in childcare provision is non-state. So can we work in that area to make that better, to feed into primary education and actually government to hopefully come in a supportive role rather than a hindering role. And not to forget about the primary sector, I think that's important, but actually do something that's achievable which have long-term economic benefits. Okay. So in the light of that 8-city data and my research, what is the challenge that we're looking at this afternoon? We're looking at the challenge, particularly at childcare and early childhood development. Because the World Bank did a white paper in 2020 saying early years is critical. We also have a problem with out-of-school children, and we have a problem with affordability. And all these things affect nutrition, and so you end up with stunted children who are held back throughout their education. Girls' education is critical, but often that can be the first thing to suffer when there's economic hardship. And that has an impact on family side, because the more educated the girls are, the longer they stay in education, the later they tend to get married, the fewer teenage pregnancies, and the fewer children they decide typically to have. So if you want to bring population down to a sensible level of growth, with benefits for the child, but also for the society and environment, you would actually want more money going into girls' education. Okay, that's still a challenge in terms of achieving that. And if you want, in the 21st century with AI, we talked about confidence and articulate children, but you want them to be creative, problem-solving young people, then the more ECD you have, and the better education you have, the more likely they are to cope with that challenge. And I think what you also want to do, potentially, the challenge is how do you get community to support this sector? And they might be supporting it already with the paying of fees, but is there a role for churches to play? Is there a role for civic bodies to play? Is there a role for NGOs to play? So you actually crowd people into making the sector stronger. So I want to just take us to childcare and early childhood development and give you some examples of Rwanda and South Africa in particular, just to show you the kind of challenge that exists, but also the opportunity that exists. So in Rwanda, they've done a census and found that 19% of children in Rwanda have access to affordable quality childcare and early childhood development. And the government would like that to be 80 to 90%. So there's a gap. A report, I'll give you the details of where you can get some of the resources if it's interesting. Ready for School, we've just released a report last month. And they did a randomized control trial of children who'd gone to ECD and then to primary 1, primary 2, primary 3, and tried to see whether it had cumulative benefit. What they found was it had a positive effect on academic performance, particularly in primary school 1 to 3. They saw the benefits coming through from those children that had been in ECD as opposed to the children that hadn't been, and attendance, so far less dropping out of school. 41% had a higher chance of going from grade 1 to grade 2. If at the end of primary 1 you don't do well enough in the internal exams, they tend to hold you back for a year rather than letting you on. These children that benefited from the ECD had a greater chance of going forward. And the short-term aim is 45%, the long-term aim is at 80%, but there's very limited government funding. So this is the ECD childcare gap that Rwanda faces. The other thing that benefited these low-cost ECD providers was there was greater parental involvement, which is what you kind of expect because parents are paying small amounts of money. But that was important for the child's performance. So it's not just about schools. Parents have a role to play as well, particularly where it's a single-parent household. So one has to say, okay, that's why I mentioned the earlier thing about how do you bring other parts of the community into this space so that, in Africa they say it takes a village to raise a child. But how do you galvanize that village to play the different roles to support the parents to bring up these children as best they can? Now let's compare that with South Africa. So a recent report has come out called Thrive by 5, funded by Yellowwoods. You know Nando's, the chicken people?
Yeah.
Okay, so the people behind Yellowwoods are the people who founded Nando's. Okay, so they've got a philanthropic foundation called Yellowwoods, which is a native South African tree, if you are interested. They just did a report. I think it's the first time in Africa that someone's done a baseline report on what's happening in the childcare ECD space. And what they found is that 42% of children are on track in terms of cognitive development, readiness for going to primary school. That means that 58% are not. Okay, so it's not completely disastrous, but it's not as good as it could be. And 29% are on track in terms of what they call fine motor coordination and visual motor integration. Now that's very long psychological description, but basically those are the skills you need if you want to become literate. They're the foundations of literacy. So only 29% have got those skills, even though 42% might be on track. When it comes to this particular area, that's much lower. And just to give you an idea of the household background, when it came to books, looking at all these childcare and ECD centres, only 11% of households had more than 5 children. Okay, and what they say about childcare, I think it's about 80% of the informal childcare provision, there were no books. So that's some, so with work to be done, is basically what this report was saying. But what's interesting, and we'll talk about some of the Thrive by 5 initiatives in South Africa. DG Murray is a foundation. Murray and Roberts was a construction company. DG Murray actually set up a foundation, and they said we're going to focus on early childhood development. And they funded this outfit called Smart Start. So Smart Start is a kind of social franchise, and they've got over 1,000 early childhood development centres to try and improve the quality of those ECD centres. But they also said we can't ignore government policy. What do we do about government policy? Because the government didn't give any money to ECD, the government didn't have any regulations or rules about ECD, because it only focused on primary education and secondary education. So they said to the government, can we not develop policies to encourage more ECD provision of quality and access to it? The government said, well, we haven't got the resources. This is South Africa, this is quite a wealthy country. So they said, okay, we'll second 2 of our staff to your department to develop policy. And it took 7 years before that policy was accepted. But it was accepted and they passed the legislation, etc., etc. Now, in South Africa, all ECD childcare providers are encouraged to register. If you register, you're not becoming licensed, you're just registering. And you automatically become a bronze holder, a bronze recognition that you're a registered entity. And obviously there are gradations within bronze, but at least you've got a bronze certificate. Now the incentive is if you improve the conditions and the way you provide childcare and ECD, you can get to silver. And if you meet the requirements for silver, then the government will give you a per capita grant of approximately £1 per child per day for the school year. So there's a financial incentive for ECD providers to become silver and to qualify for that. And then obviously you can move from silver to gold. But the policy they put in and the budget they put aside, the hundreds of millions of dollars to put aside in South Africa, is to pay for that progression of ECDs and get them up to silver. So I thought it doesn't mean the parents are not paying, because the parents are still paying up to 40% of the per capita cost that these ECD, so if they're charging $10, the government will provide $4 going to that per month. So the parents are still contributing 60% of the cost of education, but the government's going on with $4 on top of that. So that means you can pay your teachers more, you can have better nutrition, more equipment and so forth. And hopefully, one of the things that I think is still missing in South Africa is access to finance, because we get to see whether that achieving silver means that you can get loans from banks. But but at least they're moving in the right direction. So I think that's quite an interesting thing. Groups like Love Trust have got a social franchise to try and train ECD teachers to actually do stuff. And there's a new development impact. Do you know what development impact bonds are? Anybody? Social impact bonds? Okay, so Education Outcomes Fund was founded about 7 years ago to try and use social impact bonds. So this is what I teach on at Oxford. A social impact bond is where you've got a social outcome that you want to achieve, and the government is prepared to pay for that, but it's only prepared to pay for success. Okay. So the first social impact bond that was ever done in education was in India, and they wanted to encourage children and girls in particular to stay in school at the primary school level. So UBS Optimus, which is the Swiss Bank Foundation, said, okay, we'll invest money to a local NGO called Educate Girls. So we'll give them the money for 3 years to try and increase the attendance of girls to low-cost schools, and that they stay in those schools and that they learn something in those schools. Okay. And then there's a charity called SIF, we said, if you succeed, we will pay UBS a return of up to 18% on the money that they've invested. Okay, so you had the investor investing in the NGO, the NGO performing to actually try and achieve these goals, and if they succeeded, then the investor would get their money back and a return. If they failed, the investor would lose all their money. So it's an impact investor taking the risk, and a charity foundation being the outcomes payer. That's the development impact bond. The social impact bond is the same structure, except instead of the charity or foundation being the outcomes payer, it's the government who pays. So in South Africa, they've just launched an education outcomes fund for childcare, where if improvements take place in access and quality of ECD provision, the government will pay these per capita grants. So, and if we've invested in this to make it all happen, working with Smart Start, for example, to work with these low bronze level ECD providers to try and get them to silver, they'll invest in Smart Start, give them money to do what they need to do, and if they succeed, the government will pay. So it's quite a nice way, I think, of crowding in government into this space. Doesn't take away the autonomy of the early childhood development SMEs, but it does actually build on what they're doing. And it means the government doesn't try and do it all itself. I think in terms of classical economics, which is what the Vinson Centre is all about, I think it's a good example of working with government, but with the private sector as well. And Singakwenza, I was visiting South Africa in September and went to see this organisation in KwaZulu-Natal. And what they do is work with 100 ECD providers in KwaZulu-Natal, 20 I think in Gauteng. It's a non-government organisation. And you can see here percentage of children falling far behind, baseline and end line. So you can see that having had their input, that's the green has really improved and the people falling behind has really reduced. In terms of emergent literacy and language, it's a similar story. Their involvement has actually improved that percentage of children falling far behind and gross motor development. So they try to measure the impact that they're having as an NGO. So they're donor dependent. So the question is, could you invest in Singakwenza along the development impact, social impact online, to actually take their intellectual property and apply that to other ECDs that has that big impact? And with the government, you're prepared to recognise it. It just seems to me that you could actually do something. What I like about Singakwenza is, I think I had to delete this slide because it wasn't too big. So I had a picture. They basically work in recycling waste materials to make items of purposeful play. They take egg cups and use those, egg boxes, and use that for counting. They take plastic bags and make them into ropes. They take bottle tops and create a ball, and you catch things in the bottle top. Like a Coke bottle which you've taken off the bottle. So they're trying to use appropriate technology in low-income areas to give toys which are not costing the earth, and you're not using plastic. You're using recycled plastic, but not new plastic toys. But the other important thing they do is they work with an ECD provider 2 years. So they have a mentor coach going in to work with the teachers every week, 1 day a week. And what they found was to get these results, you spend 1 year doing this, but you don't embed the practice unless you spend the second year. Okay, because basically you're investing in these teachers and these people to try and improve their pedagogical knowledge of how children learn through play. Remember, most of these practitioners are not qualified. So how do we actually work with that informal sector to get them to learn and to be better teachers? But the use of play is not new. So this is, I come from Oxford, This is from the Ashmolean Museum. This is a 15th century Italian Renaissance chess set. Very beautiful. And chess originally, I think, came from, it's either India or Persia. But it's obviously a game that you can play for strategic reasons, but the skills that you learn with that, so I'm involved with the charities who run schools in refugee settlement areas in Uganda and Kenya, trying to introduce chess into those situations to actually give children the skills of patience, strategy, making decisions under pressure, particularly when they come from post-traumatic or traumatic situations. Yeah, you can actually learn lots of soft skills by playing chess. So that's good. But what's interesting about this chess set is you had the chess set there, but then underneath it was a backgammon set. And a friend of mine said the good thing about having chess and backgammon kind of combined is you can plan as much as you want in life, but there's a thing called chance, when unpredictable things happen. And the advantage of learning to play these things is it teaches you life skills. So you can plan, but you've also got to be aware that there's serendipity or there's opportunity. And so, by playing these games, you learn new skills. So that's what they're doing in Singapore by just taking purposeful play and learning from that. So, two other initiatives in Uganda and Rwanda. We'll do Rwanda first because I've taught people at Save the Children on impact investing. What they did was they went back to Rwanda and said, there are these ECD centres, they want finance to grow and expand. They can't get it, so let's create a pot of money and we'll do impact investing into ECD providers. We'll lend them money to actually help them grow. So it's an investment decision. And we'll try and link that to vocational training. There's one other thing there called Chancellor that will help fund the training of these teachers. They work with the Mothers Union, which is a church-based group in Africa, to try and get them involved in this space to become more entrepreneurial. And what they did was, with these ECD women entrepreneurs in particular, they would improve the quality of the teachers in their schools by training, but they also give them business skills. So that hopefully some of those individual teachers would spin off and do their own thing in due course. So you give them business skills as well as pedagogical skills. And that's what Single Friends were doing as well. They're teaching them bookkeeping at the same time as doing the teacher training. And they've also worked with government to try and get the government to change policy and recognise these sorts. And they haven't quite moved as far as South Africa has, but hopefully they're working in that space. And what they want to do is create a demonstration case of what can work with that money going into those schools and coming back with a sensible return to be reinvested. But can they do something in a Rwanda context to make the ECD sector grow from 19% to much more than that, show that it can be sustainable financially? The idea being they would then actually roll that out to the 20 other countries that say the children work in Africa. So it's a sustainable form of financing, improved access to quality ECD. That's what they're trying to do there, and working with government as much as possible. And I just read recently in October 25, so last month, the first Education Outcomes Fund of $13 million was done in Rwanda. So what's happening here is they're looking to work with, I think it's 305 ECDs in Rwanda to actually improve the quality of provision. And the government are prepared to pay for that if it's delivered. And UBS Optimus are investing in that. But the people who are implementing it, say the children, plan, and how we call it, HSC. So these are local NGOs working on the ground to try and deliver, just like Educate Girls did that in Pakistan, sorry, in India. Okay, so the reason I mentioned Rwanda, I think, is a good example of an NGO realizing that you can't carry on depending on donations. Dependency and all the other problems, corruption that come with aid, you can't carry on depending. It's not going to be sustainable if you just have donations. Can we use some of our donor money to create pots of money for investing, which will actually be more sustainable. So I think it's an important shift in their thinking. In Uganda, we've got a group called the Global South Fellowship of Anglicans, who are the Anglican Church in the Global South, like Brazil, Uganda, Madagascar, and so forth, saying what can we do to improve economic empowerment in our communities? And particularly, what can we do with low-cost schools? Not necessarily run them ourselves, but can we support them? Can we give them our buildings and space to use during the week so they don't actually have to use shacks or their back gardens? And can we actually encourage our members to become entrepreneurs in this space? Because if the needs are there for more ECD, can they play a role in that space? And if they've got finance, can they make that available? And in Uganda, there's an outfit called Jackfruit that grew in Kenya as a non-bank financial institution deliberately to finance low-cost schools. So they now in Kenya finance over 700 schools. They do things in bookkeeping and financial management of the schools to train the schools in that, also teacher training. They link up with partners to work in that space. But they're primarily a lender to these schools to help meet that gap which the banks are not interested in. And they use fintech, mobile phones and mobile money to get money out there. So they started in Kenya, they moved to Uganda. So again, they're trying to meet that finance gap that we identified. And in Uganda, where I'm due to be in 2 weeks' time, my plan is to link these various people together. We say the children, engage with government to see what can be done there, and to see whether we can come up with an implementation plan for replicating what we're hoping to do in Rwanda, in Uganda, evidence what works, and then ideally come up with, learn from South Africa, work with South African organisations, work in the edtech space, fintech space, to evidence what can be done and then hopefully replicated elsewhere. These are other initiatives that are taking place in Africa. So I mentioned Jackfruit. Ed Partners is another financial institution that's lending into this space. And then you've still got philanthropies. The philanthropists are still trying to do things, but again, on a more sustainable basis. So two people I know, Edwards and Hibbert, they're working with, I think, 30 plus schools in Kenya to improve their financial management. And that's interesting. Yeah, it's fine. And what they're seeing is they can actually work with their schools to make them more sustainable. If they improve their financial management, they actually become much more better, they become better businesses. In Nigeria and Ghana, you've got other financial institutions, Edify and Edfin, all focusing on low-cost schools. So you have got this emergence, just like microfinance 40 years ago came into what's called an institutional void. The banks weren't interested in providing credit to micro-entrepreneurs, particularly women. And so that institutional void existed, and microfinance institutions started to come into that space and made it a multi-billion-dollar industry. What you're now seeing in education is these non-bank financial institutions coming into this space that the banks have created a void because they're not interested in financing these low-cost schools to actually work with them to earn the money. Now, so that's, it's an emerging industry. And then in Congo, the person behind Oracle, Oracle, the big software company, this SPAC is founded by the wife of Mr. Oracle. And she's taking environmentally based ECD into Congo, not the DRC, the other Congo, small one, Brazzaville. So you still got philanthropic initiatives trying to do something in this space. The question is, can we link them to more sustainable forms of finance and eventually crowd the government in to support it? And this is a British philanthropic foundation called Perivoli. They're working in those countries, they're made in Southern Africa, but they use tablets to actually track the training of teachers in very rural schools. And so they go and work with the teachers with a trainer, and so far I've trained over 33,000 teachers. But they deliberately try and do it beneath the radar, so they're not trying to help those schools become licensed, they're just doing what they can with the unlicensed schools. So again, can we tap into these relationships and leverage off them bringing finance alongside it so the schools can have access to finance to grow and expand. So we build a much stronger sector in childcare and the ECD. A colleague of mine at Oxford called David Johnson has developed an app called Oxtrack. So he's been involved in education policy, teacher training, World Bank programs for the last 30 years. A bit like Stefan Durkheim, what have I learned from all this? He said basically, you can have as many workshops as you like, but it's not going to achieve very much. You can have as many clever schemes as you want, you can have as many classrooms as you want, but unless you've got a good quality teacher, children are not going to learn. So Oxtrack is an app-based invention where you take the questions from level 1, 40 questions looking at various domains of pedagogical knowledge that the teacher should have. And if you get over 60%, you can move on to level 2. If you get less than 60%, it uses AI to identify videos and content that you need to look at as a teacher to improve those areas of weakness. The idea being in 3 months' time, 6 months' time, you come back and retake that test and hopefully get enough to go on to level 2. The logic being a level 4 teacher is a competent teacher. So this is not subject knowledge, this is how do children learn? How do you manage a classroom? What do you need to know about children and their different needs and how do you accommodate them? So he's using that, and so he's looking at awareness and recognition, understanding and examination, application and analysis, synthesis and evaluation. So these are all technical terms of a pedagogical nature, but the idea being that it gives feedback to the teacher and it then provides us a methodology of improving areas of weakness and strengthening what they're doing. So he's piloting it at the moment. He's just had the first pilot in Kenya and another one in Nigeria to actually learn. Okay, so this is the app that he developed. The idea being, can that be applied to government schools,
low-cost schools.
and provide a basis for improving quality of education? Yes, please. Okay, so I'm just putting that up because I think it's a useful tool that could actually help the vocational training of these unqualified teachers to actually get governments to recognise that this could lead to some form of qualification. I know here at Buckingham University you've got a diploma for low-cost teachers, and whether that could be adapted to this context but made affordable and more accessible is an area I'm quite interested in exploring, because one doesn't need to recreate the wheel. You can take this assessment and then link that to some form of content, examination, teacher observation, to get your qualification, which is recognised in Africa by authorities saying if you've got this, you're not recognising it as a teaching qualification, you're not a certified teacher, but we recognise it as a practitioner qualification. And that's good enough, and hopefully it provides a gold standard for childcare and ECD and potentially primary school teachers. So that's what I'd be quite interested in exploring. So what are the benefits? We've got 2 more slides to go, I think. Economic development. The benefits, if we get finance of the $4.2 billion that I've identified just in those 8 cities, in sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to be close to $10 billion. But when you move beyond those cities to the other towns and cities in those countries, the rural areas and so forth, so there's a significant financial requirement for greater investment in quality childcare in ECD and the kind of low-cost space. That would fund school expansion. That would create also, instead of having 160 children, hopefully go to 300 children, which means you're more viable and you can pay your teachers more. Also, it would create money for new childcare and ECD centres, which in turn would create jobs. And so I think I calculated, just with that 4.2 billion, you're talking about creating over 1 million jobs and educating another 14 million children, just in that space there. So it's something that would have a positive economic development. It would that's where the vocational training with University of Buckingham Teacher Training Program, if that could be in kind of brought into this space or the equivalent, then ideally linked up with local accredited institutions. I think you want some African content there as well. You could actually train 1 million practitioners. That's quite a significant number, I think. But other jobs will be created as well in terms of the soft skills, the social skills that these young practitioners learn. Even if they don't stay in education, they should hopefully have skills that allow them to find other jobs or even become entrepreneurs. So the soft skills you would learn through this whole process of training on the job would actually equip you for other vocations and becoming more economically active. Plus also, it has benefits for working mothers. The more affordable quality childcare that's available, women in particular, working mothers, can go and work. So all the research shows that they end up becoming more economically active, generating more income, their children's nutrition increases. So by providing better and more affordable quality childcare and ECD, that has a major impact on working women. But also other support sectors will benefit. So the nutrition that these schools need, the food needs to come from somewhere, it needs to be prepared by someone. The clothing for uniforms, the tech that can be used in the classroom, the financial management that's needed, the training of people in bookkeeping and so forth, and the role of financial institutions. Well, as I mentioned, as they grow and expand, that creates more jobs and more revenue and more economic activity. You also get new industries which benefit economic development. So a number of those initiatives are African-led initiatives. They're not coming from the rich north, they're actually being developed locally. And so, that means you've got more back office, you've got more call centres, more care sector, people who've got skills that can actually be involved in other industries in those countries. And then you've got the youth and the young people themselves benefiting from becoming more numerate, literate, creative, problem-solving, critical thinkers. Because if they don't have those skills, then what are they going to do when they grow up? And lastly, I think from an economic development perspective, you want to crowd in government from the regulatory perspective and also from the financing perspective. These are some of the resources that you might want to look at that I put up here. So, Kwenza, the South Africa report, Rwanda, Kenya, etc. And then DIRCON I mentioned there, and my piece of work is there as well. So I think it just shows you there are resources out there that people are actually looking. Gates is behind this tech and AI here, where they're actually trying to say what role AI in low-cost education and education in Africa. So it's quite, the fact that Gates is behind that, realizing that AI has a danger of leaving Africa and emerging markets behind, but actually can it be used in a way which prevents that from happening and brings Africa along as well. So in conclusion, we've tried to look at affordable private childcare and ECD, particularly with a focus on those 8 cities. We've looked at the importance of Thrive by 5, that the more cognitive development, social engagement, skills development, literacy foundations, community foundations that children have, learning by play, the better their life chances, the better cumulative education that they'll have, the less likely they are to drop out of school. Girls in particular will end up having more choice in life. So it has benefits for the children, but also for society. There's a huge opportunity to finance this sector on a sustainable basis, not a donation basis. But blended finance has a role to play. So that's where philanthropy combines with straightforward investing or provision of finance. As we're seeing with that Thrive by 5 report in South Africa is funded by philanthropists, but that provides potentially the basis for more sustainable financing. And what DG Murray did with Smart Start and what they did with the government shows that you can bring about change from a philanthropic basis if you've got clear focus. There are tools out there like Oxtrack using AI to try and improve quality. So if we can improve quality of teacher quality, early years, primary, to actually do that in state schools and non-state schools, we've got the possibility of linking that to some accredited qualification. That would improve that space. And that's where the vocational training for tech, using vocational, I think we use technology there for teacher training as well. Government policy and support is important, but is in its early days of recognition. But the economic benefit just from those 8 cities is we could create 1 million jobs and 14 million children who are not currently receiving quality ECD to actually get it. And we'd have an impact in terms of flourishing youth and jobs. That's my email address. You're welcome to contact me, but now we'll move, I think, to questions, answers, or just questions.